Welcome to Books in 5, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he and his co-author have written an eye-opening new book, Busting the Myths About Inflation. Nicolò, thank you so much for being our guest on Books in 5. Please tell us your full name, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Hi, thank you for inviting me here. My name is Nicolò Fraccaroli, and I'm going to present the book that I published with Mark Blight, with Norton as editor, Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. And I'm calling from Washington, D.C., where I'm based.
And you're currently working with the World Bank, right?
I'm working as an economist at the World Bank and as a visiting scholar at Brown University, yes.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. Your book is a necessary examination of a topic that has been at the forefront of people's lived experience over the past few years. What was the motivation for exploring inflation and its impact on the economy?
Well, the fact is that inflation affects everyone's life. And there is this quote from Ben Bernanke, Nobel Prize of Economics and former chair of the Fed, that said that inflation affects everyone differently from other variables, like for instance, unemployment, which is generally true. Like, unemployment affects mostly people that are unemployed, but inflation, while it affects everyone because everyone is facing higher prices, has also some very uneven effects. So there are some people that pay a higher cost and face higher inflation than others. And usually, or actually in all cases, the people that lose the most from inflation are the poorest. And so this was initially the main motivation. So there is like part of the debate that is really looking to inflation as a monolithic issue, whereas as I just mentioned, it has like different facets and it affects people in different ways. There is a chapter, for instance, where we discuss inflation as a class war, so inflation wars that are class wars. But the other reason is that when you start like looking at inflation as a problem between like indeed inflation winners and losers, you also notice that there is something that is really needing some more investigation related to the fact to the policies that we adopt to fight inflation. And if you look back at the debate about inflation in 2021, when inflation started in the US, there were some people that were saying that to fight inflation, we needed a recession. So we needed the Federal Reserve to hike rates in a way that it would have created a lot of unemployment. So at least, for instance, 10% of unemployment was one estimate. And that was the only way that we had to fight inflation, which may sound weird because you already know that inflation is hitting the poorest the hardest. And then you also create a situation where it becomes more difficult for them to pay for their mortgages or for their loans. So we started wondering, why do we think of inflation in this way? Why do we think that these policies are the best policies to really fight inflation? And does it really make a lot of sense? What we find in the book is that when you look back at the history and why we ended up like choosing certain policies instead of others, it doesn't all make sense. And what we do in the book is really like, as you were saying, to debunk some of the myths related to inflation and how we fight.
Nicolò, let's talk a little bit more about Isabella Weber and what she was bringing forward, because you write about her in the book.
So Isabella Weber is an interesting example of why the debate was taking a weird turn, because she published an article on The Guardian, which was a journalistic article where she was an op-ed where she was explaining why she thought that price control weren't really necessarily a bad policies. And this created what we call in the book as a sort of Twitter storm. It was on Twitter that like a lot of economists from different sides of the aisle started attacking her for this position. And price control was one of the taboos in the inflation debate. The reason is that like hiking interest rates, price controls were one of the policies that we learned that were on which our opinion was built based on the experience of the 70s and 80s. And what we do in the book is to explore this experience. And we noticed that, for instance, price control, we think that they are unable to work because they didn't work during the Nixon era in the 70s. And when you actually look at the case of price controls in detail, you see that they didn't work because they were initially mandatory. And when they were mandatory, actually inflation was going down. But then when at a certain point, the government decided to make them voluntary, and that's where inflation started to go up again. And so the fact that price control didn't work precisely in that case was highly related to the fact that they were made as a voluntary policy.
Nicolò, let's move on to our second question. The political economy and the makeup of who holds power in society is critical to understand how inflation operates. Walk us through the 4 genres of how people should be thinking about the causes of inflation.
Sure. So we talk in the book about like the different interpretation of where inflation came from in the 2020s. And we call them 4 genres or like 4 stories of inflation. And these are important not just because they're like a technical debate between experts, but the reason why they're important is because once you define where inflation comes from, that helps you define the solution to inflation, like what policies to adopt to really fight inflation. So there is the first story that says that inflation was caused by too much government spending. And in this case, in the case of the US, there was the Biden stimulus, the stimulus check that literally gave money to people and businesses to recover after COVID. And the idea there is that there was too much money created, chasing too few goods. And this created inflation because there was a mismatch between demand, which was increasing because a lot of people had money, against the supply, which remained constant, and actually was decreasing because of COVID. However, when you look at this example, which is something that is really beloved by Republicans, for instance, because it shows how Biden and his government program was really the cause of inflation. It's not really. It doesn't really match with a lot of empirical evidence. So probably one of the most serious studies on this is from the San Francisco Fed, which shows that probably there was some role in government spending in the US that caused inflation, but this is not the full story. We had inflation everywhere else, in Europe, for instance, in a lot of countries that didn't spend as much as in the US. To make it short, and also this study in particular say that the confidence intervals of the estimates were too large, so we couldn't really understand what the size of government spending was for inflation. But there is another side of the story, which is story 2, which says that inflation came from supply side disruptions. So, of course, there was COVID that created some problems in value chains. It became more expensive to transport things. It became more expensive to find companies that would replace companies that were previously disrupted during COVID. There was the Ukraine war that spiked up energy prices. So there are a lot of exogenous causes that come from the supply side of the economy, so the production side of the economy, that really are a cause for inflation. And while the previous story would suggest that then the solution would be to cut spending and increase interest rates and create a recession so that you would kill demand, the second story, the supply side story, was associated with a team transitory group of economists. That's how they call themselves. Paul Krugman was one of them, and they said, well, since this inflation shock is coming from the supply side, what we need to do is just wait. We don't really need an interest rate hike. Maybe we need to hike interest rate, but just moderately to make sure that inflation expectations remain in check. But we don't need really a policy that is so disruptive and that increases unemployment so much. I'm going beyond maybe time, or I still have some time to respond.
You got 90 more seconds. What are the other 2 stories?
Okay. The other 2 stories are, well, one is quite strictly related to story 1, which is the labor market story. So the idea is that you have too much demand, prices are going up, and then what is happening is that workers are asking for higher wages because things start to cost more. And so they ask for a higher wage, and let's say that they get it. Then the firm is facing higher costs, or higher production costs, because it's paying a higher salary to its workers. And so once it faces these costs that are higher, it's going to charge a higher price on its final product. which is going to be faced by consumers who are actually workers who are going to ask for a higher price. And so this is going to ask for a higher wage. And so this is going to get into a spiral that is called the wage price spiral, which is something that a lot of economists, but also a lot of central bankers were fearing when inflation started. So the point with this story is that we didn't see it happening. So it's one of the weak aspects of this story. It didn't happen. And when you look at the evidence, the historical evidence about wage price spiral, which is something that economists and central bankers fear a lot, there is an IMF paper that shows that using historical data, you don't have many wage price spirals happening in history. So it's really something that we learned again from the experience of the 70s, but it was a very different economy, a very different context where indeed trade unions were also stronger. Now trade unions are way weaker. Do we have time for the last story?
Yeah, you know what? I'll give you a little bit of time because I know we want to dive deeper into that fourth story because it's important. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So while I said that the first story was generally supported by Republicans, the story number 4 is generally supported by the Democrats, and it's the story for which inflation came from corporate profits. So firms saw inflation as an opportunity to increase their prices because this would have simply led to higher profits. And here, when we talk about evidence, there is some evidence in favor, in support of this theory, which is again one of the theories that Isabella Weber, that we mentioned before, was supporting, which is that we saw an increase in profit that is higher when markets are more concentrated. Indeed, it shows that when firms are more able to coordinate between themselves, they are more able to really profit from inflation, which is supporting this view. But it's also very difficult to say that this is happening because to show that, you have also to show that these are profits that are not deriving from the increasing prices in intermediate goods. So when a firm is setting a price on its final good, it's also considering the cost of the intermediate goods that it buys to reach that price. So it's a bit difficult to support also this story. And this leads us to why, the stories should all be considered when we consider inflation.
Great. I know we went over time, but I really wanted us to consider those 4 stories because they're such an important aspect of inflation. Let's move on to our third question. And you brought it up earlier, but the 1970s and the 1980s loom large in the story you are telling as these decades laid the groundwork for the present era. What actually took place in this time period as policymakers responded to inflation?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting time period because it was the previous inflation period, which took place before the one that we just experienced. So we learned a lot from that, but sometimes we didn't really learn the right story. That's what we are doing. For instance, it's true, hiking rates, as Volcker did, was really helpful in fighting inflation. But did we really need to have such an aggressive monetary tightening, which created a recession? So just think that in the 80s, the rates were raised from 10 to 19%. And they managed to drop inflation, which was around 13%, and it went down to 4%. But unemployment doubled and output fell. So there was a lot of side effects, and we're sure about the side effects, but we're not really sure whether this was necessary in this magnitude, And so one of the stories that we learned is that hiking rates is good, but we also needed to be more cautious this time because some of the shocks were similar, but the economy was very different. Indeed, I told you, for instance, that we didn't have a wage price spiral. What I was mentioning is that in the 70s, we had trade unions that were very strong all across the world. Now trade unions are way weaker, and so they're really not that able to bargain for higher wages in response to inflation. We also learned from that experience that price controls don't work. Again, I was explaining that one of the reasons is that when Nixon imposed price control, the inflation was going down between 1970 and 1972, when controls were actually mandatory. So inflation dropped from 6 to 3%. But then in 1973, when they decided to anticipate phase 2 of the controls and made the controls actually voluntary, so they were not controls anymore, inflation came back to 6, and then it spiked without any check. So There are a lot of stories that we can grasp from the experience of the 70s, but what we explain in the book is that they are not necessarily like the ones that we may think. So, for instance, the idea that we should have caused a recession and we should all have suffered to get out of the inflation period, we saw that it wasn't necessary, and luckily, central banks were cautious enough not to really jump to this conclusion, as instead some economists.
Let's move on to our fourth question. My favorite chapter is the one where you examine hyperinflationary episodes, as it highlights the importance of understanding the specifics of each country. What role does international trade and the balance of payments play in the crisis that you write about?
Yeah, so hyperinflation is a very rare phenomenon. It's generally defined as a monthly inflation rate of 50% or more. And even the inventor of this threshold, who is called Kagan, he said that it was quite an arbitrary threshold, but it's what economists generally use. And it's very rare because, again, historical evidence shows that we didn't experience many hyperinflation in history. And we thought that it's interesting not only because some people, when inflation started, were arguing that we were going to end up like Venezuela or Argentina or the Weimar Republic in Germany because of hyperinflation, because there was too much government spending, but also because, indeed, as you mentioned, it tells you a lot about like the specificities of inflation, depending on the country where it happens or the time period where it happens. And so the main story that is told about hyperinflation is the monetary story. The monetary story says that there is too much money that is chasing too few goods, and this is because there is too much money printing. But it doesn't really tell you why there is all this money printing. And when you look at the famous cases of hyperinflation, and we examine 4 of them in the book, we examine Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and the Weimar Republic of Germany, there are always some specific factors that led those countries to print more. Of course, there is part of the story that is related to that. So there were governments that were spending too much, there were populist governments, and they were really overspending. But that wasn't enough. So there was always also a balance of payment crisis that is related to the fact that the economy is open, the currency is being devalued, and as the currency loses value, you need to buy goods from abroad, but the imports become more expensive. As imports become more expensive, you have to print more money to really have enough currency to buy those imports. And this creates a vicious loop for which at a certain point, investors will not want to finance you anymore, to buy your currency anymore, because it loses confidence. There are different reasons for that. I know we don't have the time to go in detail into each of them. But for instance, in Venezuela, the reason was because it was a country that was, and it still is a country that is highly dependent on oil production. And so when the price of oil goes down, the currency loses value. In Argentina, it was a problem of spending, but there was also a lot of dependence on the US dollar and on the export of commodities. And again, the commodity market was very influential to explain Argentina's inflation. In the Weimar Republic, in Zimbabwe, it was an issue related to agricultural export and a land reform that was very messy, some droughts that took place at the same time, and a war with the DRC, with the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the Weimar Republic, it's also a very complicated story, but in short, the issue was related to the fact that Germany spent too much for the war and then had to face very high reparation and a very low willingness to repay France for that debt that was caused by the war.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Weimar experience, because it was deflation that actually brought the Nazis to power, not necessarily the inflation, right?
Yeah, so in the Weimar Republic, inflation was partly because of an accident, so to say, which is Germany spending too much money in the war, thinking that they were going to win, and so they were going to ask for reparation to the war losers, but they ended up being the war losers. And then there was part of it that was intentional. Germany could have decided to undergo like an austerity program to have enough money to repay France, but they didn't have any willingness to do it. So actually, in that case, inflation or hyperinflation helped them to ease the weight of their debt. So it's very difficult to say that, like some people think, as you said, like there is this association that hyperinflation brought a lot of discontent and caused, was one of the sources of the Nazis. That this doesn't really make sense if you think that hyperinflation ended in 1923 in Germany. And it ended quite quickly, quite rapidly. What followed was 1929, the Great Depression, that indeed caused like a lot of economic troubles for the country, and the middle class was already in pain before inflation, because even before inflation, the hyperinflation started in Germany, the savings were eroded by the currency devaluation 2 years before the hyperinflation came. And the Nazis, they started gaining traction in the 30s, so straight after the Great Depression. So I think it's more plausible to think that it wasn't hyperinflation.
Let's conclude with our final question. It is essential for leaders to be better informed about how inflation affects different groups. What are the takeaways as we move into a world that is increasingly volatile?
Well, there are a few takeaways that we can think of that you can find in the book, but I can be maybe more explicit here, or like thinking about them. Thinking out loud, I would say that first of all, inflation, as we were saying at the beginning of this call, is likely to be more present in the future. It remains a relevant topic. When we started this book, we were just interested in the inflation debate. We were not really thinking like in a forward-looking way. Like some people even told us, why are you still writing about inflation? It's going to be over soon. And now inflation is lower, but we still think that it's going to be more present in the long run because, for instance, of climate change, that is going to affect food prices, but also energy prices through its impact on infrastructure and so on. But also, like, one message that is very important from our book is that you should always keep an eye on the winners and losers of inflation, but also of anti-inflationary policy. And I think central banks that have been highly criticized have actually done quite a good job, because they were very careful in like increasing the interest rate, in not hiking interest rates too much. Still like very high, and like lowest paid parts of the population, the poorest part of the population, are still suffering a lot from it. But of course, once you decide a policy, you're going to affect some and others a bit more or less. But we also learned from our book that the policies that can fight inflation, as you mentioned before, are very contextual. They depend on the country and on the time period. I mentioned price control. I don't support price control as a policy per se. And indeed, there are some cases where it was a disaster. For instance, Hungary recently did price controls, as we mentioned in the book, to fight inflation, and it had one of the highest, if not the highest, inflation rate in the European Union. Spain did the same, Portugal did the same, but they did it differently. They tailored it well to their country, and it seemed to work. It seemed to have to yield an inflation rate that was very low compared to the average European inflation rate. There are also other policies that are more tailored to certain winners or losers. We mentioned windfall taxes, for instance. So some governments decided to tax energy companies that profited a lot from inflation, or because, as I said, was coming a lot from energy prices, or banks that were benefiting a lot from the higher rates that the central bank imposed, and they transfer some of this money to the poorest. Some managed to do it, some didn't manage to do it in a proper way. But maybe a last message that I wanna mention in the book is that we talk a lot about in the book we talk a lot about the independence of central banks, and we are a bit critical to some extent to that. I think central bank independence is crucial and it's very important, but the empirical evidence for which this is important because of low inflation and price stability is not as strong. Central bank independence is very important for many other reasons, but something that is important related to independence is that we let central banks, but also in this case statistical agencies, as we're seeing lately, do their job in an independent manner and free of political pressures. As we mentioned in the book, there were in the past political attempts to alter the way that inflation is measured, the way that inflation is computed, and it didn't go very well. And we also see today that there are mounting pressures again. Even without those pressures, it is difficult to measure inflation and to analyze it. It is measured, for instance, to just understand how to put housing costs into inflation index. So independence is crucial also in that case. So be open-minded when thinking about inflation. The playbook that we built in the 70s may be wrong, So be open-minded in that sense, and be mindful of inequality and the winners and losers of inflation and of the policies to fight inflation.
Nicolò, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Nicolò, let's move on to our bonus questions. What motivated you to become an economist? Tell us a little bit more about your career.
Well, I actually started by studying political science as an undergrad. And when I was studying political science, something called the Euro area crisis started. And while the crisis was going on in Europe and it was really dominating the debate in Europe where I was based in Italy at the time. I'm Italian, I was born and grew up in Italy. I started becoming more and more interested in macroeconomics, in what it could explain, but also what it could not explain. So what were also the parts of it that remained uncharted, and I mean, also in this book, also in inflation, I really try to understand what we need in the debate that is really not discussed that much. So I think that really was an event that motivated me to start this career path.
Obviously, the book is a major achievement, but tell us more about another accomplishment that you're proud of.
Well, I think related to this book, actually, this is not necessarily, well, it's not my first book. I have another book on austerity, which is also the reason why I met Mark in the first instance. It's not a book that is as popular as this austerity book, but it was written with an economic historian called Robert Skitelski. It's called Austerity versus Stimulus. And it was a very important achievement for me because I was a master's student at the time. And austerity was still like a very heatedly debated issue. And as I was studying at LSE in London at the time, I was thinking like that it didn't really make that much sense. But it wasn't necessarily the consensus. It was maybe the first time that I was kind of pushed to take a position, maybe a bit early on in my career or in my age, on a very important topic. And I took the chance. I thought I wanted to write what I thought made sense without really thinking, oh, I need to forecast this or that. Like, I just think this is common sense. I think I think austerity is wrong. I think there are historical cases that show that, and I think these historical cases, when applied to today's cases, really make a lot of sense. And then what happened is that I saw more and more research from also like official institutions like the International Monetary Fund or other researchers that are very established, way more established than me as a master's student, that started saying the same thing. But that happened after I did the book. So I was really happy to see that if you're really convinced about some beliefs, technical or not, in this case it was quite technical, but like you can get some payoff by just being like happy that you were right somehow.
Nicolò, what are you working on next?
Oh, this is a good question. Well, I'm still going on with a lot of research. I actually have a paper that recently came out as a working paper on central bank independence and sovereign borrowing. For instance, there we show that central bank independence is very beneficial for emerging markets in determining that, in helping them in borrowing for the sovereign debt. I'm still working on some financial sector issues. I still go on with my World Bank work, of course, which is on financial sector issues in Latin America. And of course, everything that I said in this call is also unrelated to my job, and it's my full responsibility, not the responsibility and not the opinion of the World Bank. I need to put this disclaimer in. So definitely, like, topic of inflation, I'm thinking about like starting a blog on inflation actually on Substack, and I will definitely keep you posted on when it goes public.
Amazing, Nicolò. Thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5. Again, the title of the book is Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. Nicolò, where can people find you?
Me or the book?
I will put a link to the book in the show notes, and I hope people buy it. If they're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from the local library. I meant on social media. Do you have? Are you active on social media?
I'm active on LinkedIn mostly, but also on Twitter. I don't post that much over there. Like Blue Sky. I still call it Twitter, not X. But you can actually find me and Mark in person in end of November, the week of Thanksgiving. We're going to be in London doing some presentation. We're going to present at the Bank of England, at LSE, at the UCL, and King's College. We're going to talk about inflation, so it's going to be some presentations related to this book. So if you want to meet us in person, we're going to be there.
I'm going to be looking at flights right now. Nicolò, thanks for joining us on Books in 5.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sudan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.